I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Senator Rob Portman blasted the Inflation Reduction Act on the Senate floor Saturday. President Biden and Democratic lawmakers have touted the legislation as a solution to combat 40-year high inflation. Republicans, including the Ohio senator, have argued that the act won't actually help bring prices down. Portman claims that the legislation is coming, quote, at the worst possible time, as June's Consumer Price Index report showed inflation hit a new 40-year high. Senate Democrats ultimately voted Sunday to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, approving the landmark $430 billion climate, tax, and health care bill.
Mr. President.
The senator from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. President, I come to the floor this evening to talk about the partisan reconciliation legislation that is before us tonight. It's named the Inflation Reduction Act, but that's misnamed because, unfortunately, it does not reduce inflation. It actually makes things worse. So when you're at the gas pump or you're at the grocery store or buying something anywhere today, you're feeling the sticker shock. And yet this legislation is going to make it even worse. It adds $700 billion more in spending and over $300 billion more in new taxes at the worst possible time, increasing costs to consumers and actually making inflation worse. The nonpartisan Penn-Wharton budget model that a lot of us have used over the years to look at various legislation predicts that it will actually increase inflation over the next 2 years. And while over time it says that may even out, it won't decrease inflation, as the name suggests and the bill sponsors claim. Why? Well, primarily because when you put $300 billion plus of new taxes on the economy, it actually hurts workers and it hurts consumers. Yes, they're saying it's going to go to companies, but what happens then? Companies pass it along. And at a time when we have the worst inflation in over 40 years, that's bad for the economy. The nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation that we have to rely on here in the Congress, not a partisan group, nonpartisan, says this bill is going to hurt Americans in nearly every tax bracket. They say that more than half of the burden of the over $300 billion in new taxes is going to fall on folks making less than $400,000 a year. Well, that directly contradicts promises made not to increase taxes on Americans at that level. Well, I'm glad the blow to manufacturers has been somewhat softened in the last 24 hours with the latest version of the bill. What the Democrats did was essentially exchange one bad tax, the book tax on manufacturers, for another bad tax, a tax that will actually tax stock buybacks that's going to hurt particularly Americans who are trying to save for retirement. Let me start with the book tax. This is a proposed tax that is very different from the existing corporate income tax, which is based on income that businesses report to the IRS when they file their taxes. That IRS income, by the way, is defined by the U.S. Congress. Here in the Senate, we debate that all the time. Is it good to have a particular tax incentive or another tax incentive? That is not in the book tax. The book tax instead looks at a company's financial statement, and that's what this new bill does. In fact, it comes up with a whole other definition of tax and therefore another tax system called the adjusted financial statement income. This is broader than the IRS income. It's not fair. It's way too complicated, and it's going to hurt employees and consumers. Taxable income owed the IRS is meant to raise revenue, and again, it includes these incentives or disincentives for certain activities, like being able to immediately deduct the cost of new equipment if you're a manufacturer. We want to encourage that, particularly in periods of high inflation, so we allow them to do that. The financial statement income is not determined by us. It's not determined by elected representatives at all. In fact, Congress does not have anything to do with it. It's actually determined by something called the Financial Accounting Standards Board, which is a private nonprofit recognized by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission as the accounting standard setting for private companies. That may work fine for determining accounting standards, but this change effectively puts these people in control of what the corporate tax base is, even though they're not elected to anything. That doesn't make sense. Let's not set up a whole new tax system for some companies. Let's learn from the past. Back in 1986, when we passed a big tax reform bill, they put a book tax in place, and it was repealed less than 3 years later. Why? Because it was viewed as unfair, way too complicated. And actually, they thought that you shouldn't have these non-elected officials deciding what the taxes ought to be. They said it was bad for the economy, too, because companies were managing to the book tax rather than the IRS tax. So let's learn from the past. Why would we want to do that again? Set up a whole other tax system, tax the American economy, tax consumers, tax workers, and do so through something that in 1986 we looked at and decided this is not working. So Democrats will say tonight, well, this new complicated tax system is just going to affect big companies. That's true. But you know what? Big companies employ a lot of people, and a lot of people are going to be hurt. They also sell to a lot of consumers, all of us who will be hurt. Last year, there were over 200 companies listed on the Fortune 500 as meeting the criteria that's set out in this legislation. They employ over 18 million Americans. It's those employees and those who are customers who are going to bear the brunt of these tax increases as it's passed down to them in the form of lower wages, lower benefits, and higher prices for goods and services. The Joint Committee on Taxation, a nonpartisan group, just last year said they expected 25% of these corporate taxes to fall on workers. Again, this means lower wages. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that employees and workers bear more like 70% of the burden of income taxes. So there's a long list of analyses in between. Let's say between 25% and 70% of these taxes are going to fall on workers in the form of lower pay and lower benefits at a time when wages are not keeping up with inflation that's getting higher and higher. And by the way, it's not just wages we're talking about. Families will now face even higher prices as the cost of corporate taxes get passed along to them. In a study last year performed by the business schools at University of Chicago and Northwestern, they found that 31% of corporate taxes fall on consumers through higher retail taxes. Aren't prices high enough? Dems have just added another new tax in the past 24 hours. Democrats now say we're going to have this complicated tax called an excise tax on stock buybacks. Again, this is instead of some of the tax they had in the other new tax that they put forward called the book tax. Now, Democrats tonight will talk about how taxing buybacks is good because it somehow hurts Wall Street fat cats. Here's the truth. It increases the price of stocks to allow buybacks, and by taking away that incentive, by putting a tax on it, there'll be less of it. So the reality is this is a tax on working families, including those trying to save for retirement when they're already dealing with the struggling portfolios due to the recent economic contraction and the record inflation we're experiencing. 58% of Americans own stock, and 60 million investors invest in an IRA or a 401k. We want people to save for retirement. It's a good thing. We want them to have healthy retirement. So when Democrats say they worry about stock prices going up, I have to ask, why are they worried about people having a healthy retirement account? Again, when companies buy back stock, it generally causes that stock to go up, which means it makes Americans' retirement accounts that much larger. Why is that a problem? The Tax Foundation says retirement accounts own 37% of all corporate stock. That's about $8.5 trillion in retirement funds. $8.5 trillion of retirement funds are in corporate stock. Americans lost about $2 trillion in the IRAs during the COVID crisis. Let's not encourage them to lose any more. Some will say, gosh, this is just 1%. Well, we know that once a tax is initiated, it tends to increase. This is the camel's nose under the tent. The first income tax in 1913, by the way, was 1%, and just on top earners. I think a lot of middle-income earners right now would be happy to have a tax rate that low. This type of proposal will impact families and their retirement, and for that reason, we should not even go down this path. Democrats will also tax employee stock ownership programs, or ESOPs, in this package. I think some of my colleagues may be surprised to hear that. ESOPs are plans that give employees ownership of their own companies with tax incentives for the dividends to go to their retirement savings. They're really popular. ESOPs work. They're great. They enjoy wide bipartisan support here in the Congress. Employees have this ownership stake, and because of that, those companies tend to do better. Employees are happier. They're more profitable. They're more productive. The companies benefit from it. I don't understand why Democrats want to punish this ownership structure. Doing so will, once again, discourage investment and hard work, and it could not come at a worse time. That's why I'll introduce an amendment tonight that will exempt ESOPs from the minimum book tax. This is a common sense amendment, nothing complicated about it. It'll encourage savings and investment. It's good for the country, and and I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who support ESOPs to support the amendment. I also plan to offer an amendment that will increase funding for Customs and Border Patrol by $500 million that will be used for new technology to detect fentanyl and other dangerous drugs that are unfortunately flooding across our southern border. Over 100,000 Americans died of drug overdoses last year, the worst year on record. Unfortunately, more and more people are dying of overdoses, and they're dying from this synthetic opioid called fentanyl. About 2/3 of those overdose deaths were due to fentanyl. At a time when deadly fentanyl is flooding across the border, only 2% of cars and only 16% of commercial vehicles are being screened. Now, these drugs come across the ports of entry, where only 2% of cars and 16% of trucks are being screened. They also come between the ports of entry. But at a minimum, we should be able to do screening of these vehicles and trucks. It's a gaping hole in our border security, and it's got to be fixed. This amendment will simply assure that the new funds in this bill for the Department of Homeland Security bureaucracy for an office called Readiness, $500 million, will be assigned to a higher priority, to have Customs and Border Protection be able to detect and stop deadly fentanyl that is being smuggled into this country at record levels. So this money would stay at the Department of Homeland Security. It will instead be used for a more urgent priority. Let's be serious about our national security and this drug crisis we face, and let's give the Border Patrol what they need to counter the drug cartels and the traffickers. Tonight, I also plan to offer an amendment to ensure that the new postal electric vehicles are actually made in the United States of America. In this bill, there is a $3 billion appropriation to the Postal Service. We just went through postal reform, as some of you know. We provided them additional funding that they needed. This is an additional $3 billion appropriation to buy electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. However, there is no requirement that these vehicles be made in America with U.S. batteries and other components. In other words, the bill uses taxpayer funds to buy electric vehicles that can be made with Chinese batteries and Chinese critical minerals. We know that this is counter to everything we're trying to do around here. We just passed legislation to make us more competitive with China. Again, we just passed legislation to provide the Post Office with funds for new vehicles, including electric vehicles. The Postmaster General just made a decision to go from 10% electric to 20% to 50%. That's already happening. But in that case, there are requirements. In this case, there are not. We know that Democrats believe that when we're expanding electric vehicles, that we ought to ensure that these vehicles are being made in America. How do we know that? Because in another part of the bill, which is the expansion of the electric vehicle tax credit, Democrats included new requirements that the tax credit reward EVs made in the United States with American components. My amendment would simply apply these identical requirements to these new electric postal delivery vehicles. Both involve taxpayer subsidies. What's good for the American driver should be good for the Postal Service. My hope is that this misnamed Inflation Reduction Act can be stopped before it makes things worse. But at least I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to look at these common sense amendments and accept some of these amendments. Some I've laid out, some others have talked about tonight, to improve a flawed bill. With that hope, I yield the floor.